Okay, hello. My name is Sarah Gura, and I'm a master's level licensed clinical professional counselor in Illinois, and I am a licensed mental health counselor here in Florida. My practice is the self-care path, and I specialize in treating first responders. I'll talk a little bit about my background in just a moment, but first and foremost, welcome. And as always, I like to invite people to sort of take a moment and adjust their seats and orient toward learning and also listening to some information that might be stressful. I'm going to record just an introductory part of this presentation and break it down in other videos so you can watch sections of it, but still maybe take a deep breath in. And on the exhale, go ahead and just kind of release some of the stress that you might be holding in your body that you didn't know that you were holding in your body. Maybe pull your shoulders down and away from your ears and let yourself sink down through your sit bones and wiggle your toes, feel your feet, feel your hands, maybe spread them like starfish and release. I always like to do that as I'm about to pay attention to maybe a new therapy hour or a class, or as I transition from one thing to the other, to sort of just create that body and somatic awareness, because we all have perceptions and exteroceptions and interoceptions, and we'll talk about what all those things are. But it is a ton of incoming information that we respond to on a cellular level. And so I like to think about mental health as starting from that very beginning point. So let's go ahead and keep it going. And I'll move to the next slide, I hope. There it goes. And really just piggybacking a little bit, some people don't know me. And if you're tuning in and this is the first time you've heard me speak in a class, I did start working in the mental health field in 2003. I've done many things, from working at a sexual assault service center, a domestic violence shelter. I worked in the maximum security prisons in Joliet, Illinois. I have worked at a DCFS facility where I was in charge of a milieu unit. I have worked in other people's private practices, but eventually at the master's level in 2007, I opened my own practice. At that time, it was called Gura Clinical Services. In 2009, I got licensed and I opened up a place, a practice called Firefighter Behavioral Health of Illinois. And I started treating more and more first responders. So my specialty area expanded to police, fire, military, dispatchers, emergency room department professionals. And as we've aged through all these years, a lot of the guys that, got promoted through chief and then retired and became chiefs of other departments, and even working with some CEOs and other admin or leadership in these first responder fields, I decided to change my practice to the self-care path. And the reason being is that when you treat mostly first responders and you end up treating mostly men in that population, they often felt that self-care was selfish. And I wanted to really make a distinction between the two. And so self-care is the healthy version. Selfish is not something I would ever recommend. But it's also kind of funny that as the times have unfolded, self-care has become this sort of, woke term that I'm not against, but that some people still wonder, like, is this, some hippy dippy kumbaya thing? And I think not. And as I speak, I hope you start to understand that as well, that this is a healthy thing to do, to take care of your mental health all the way down to that cellular level that I was talking about. And I do want to mention too that it was in 2010 that I met Jeff Dill, who is in charge of Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. He created counseling services for firefighters. He is a master's level counselor as well. And it was in meeting him and listening to his presentations that really got me involved in working with firefighters. And then again, it expanded to police, fire, military, dispatch, emergency department professionals, and et cetera. But I remember going to his training with a thought in my mind, what in the world do first responders need? Like, why would we be talking about counseling? So I was pretty naive at that time. And by the end of the year, I had so many referrals to um, go to different family focus days, they called them back then, and mental health, gatherings, I guess we can call that. And that's what led to me going on all those ride-alongs. So I was doing ride-alongs when, after that first year, some of the guys said, "Will you do a presentation based on everything that you're going through?" And so I created this course, First Responder Psychological Support, and it has evolved quite a bit over the years. So you're seeing the latest version in 2025. And it is a reflection of everything that I've learned on those ride alongs, but also what I've learned being a therapist for first responders. Um, I have treated thousands over the last 15 plus years, and I do it full time. I have also written curriculum for first responder teams. I have written a curriculum for therapists that was approved by the National Board of Certified Counselors. They had to take 40 hours of classroom, 40 hours of ride-alongs, and do 40 hours of supervision, and coined or copyrighted. What's the other word? I got a logo. Anyway, we got all that stuff settled back in 2013 and 2014. And again, the job, the career, the profession has evolved quite a bit since then. So I'll just keep moving on here. I want to thank everybody also one more time for coming to this channel, and I hope you subscribe and like it and give me some comments and feedback. As you'll see there in the bottom, you're always welcome to contact me for questions, comments, insults. We always learn, and there's always a warning about my content. I speak candidly, I'm speak freely kind of person. And if you need to take a break, please do. I also encourage people to take notes. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, you're welcome to have it, but please don't present it yourself. And I'm not going to speak for 2 hours rapidly right now, but usually when I'm hired to give a presentation, I stand up and we hit all the information within a time limit. Whereas this, I feel I can sort of unfold the information. And so one of the first things I also want to unfold is that first responder psychological support wasn't always a thing, and we know that. It still, in some worlds, isn't. But shortly after 9/11 happened, we noticed how much we do not take care of first responders. And a bunch of professionals got together and they did their white papers, as we call them, and they came up with 16 life safety initiatives. And number 13, I call it the redheaded stepchild of them all, because we're wearing seatbelts and we put on our SCBA. This was fire specific at the time. And we talk about all this, safety training, but we still sort of shy away from initiative number 13, which is first responders and their family members must have access to counseling and psychological support services. And initially we slapped an EAP on that, and guys were calling 1-800-EAP, and those therapists were not trained and they weren't ready, and they didn't have the background information about the career to really connect. And the Therapeutic Alliance is all about having to make that connection so that we could protect the process of therapy. And I'll be talking about that down the line in other YouTube podcasts as well. But mainly, I remember when I first started, uh, the guys would sit in front of me and say, if you don't work out, I'm done. I'm not doing this counseling therapy shit anymore. And so the pressure was on. And I was lucky that I was already doing ride-alongs and I was learning the language. I was going through the day. I was witnessing what happens on the ambulance or on patrol or in a hospital and also in dispatch. And so that stuff, it helps you to sort of not only empathize, but have compassion when you're dealing with human illness, death, suffering, stupidity, property destruction, politics and bullshit, and all of this, which I'm going to cover on another slide. But all of that is included in number 13. It's an occupational issue. First responder psychological support must be addressed. And I have to say that, along the journey, I've met many, many other providers, and they're so beautiful and sincere in their work. We all have different backgrounds, and we come to you with different specialties or different perspectives. Mine does not include having any family members or life partners that are first responders. Sometimes I'm asked about that, like, how did you get into it? And it really was through seeing Jeff Dill speak. I don't have it in my personal life, which makes me a different kind of provider. And so I also realize that I am not for everyone, but that's true for every therapist. And the view that I take is that if you're helping a first responder, I support you and I can learn from you and we can all learn from each other because we're all pioneering this field. And to say that I am going on 18 years as a mental health professional blows my mind. I'd like to think that I'm not that old yet, but we're all here doing some really incredible work in different facets of first responder psychological support. And as I say that, this is why I have on the slide that we are not just looking for subject matter experts. We all have this responsibility to pay attention to first responder psychological support. So from probie to chief, whether you're in leadership, administration, or it's your first year, down to that individual first responder and the first responder's significant other, we need to be thinking about this. Now, I definitely will cover a little bit more about significant other supports because I don't know if we orient them to the reality of what shift work is like, what being connected to very closely in a home environment to a first responder may be like, especially if they don't have first responder psychological support. And so I talk about how whenever you have somebody in that rookie or probie position during that first year, their significant other should also participate in a bit of a probie year. Those significant others and spouses and parents, they don't swear in, but they are a huge factor in whether or not a first responder is functioning. So it's the whole unit, and we have to take care of them. But I'll move on to the second point that I have on this slide, which is this is all about safety. We have training to make sure you can size up a building, on how to handle pointing your weapon at someone or doing some medical procedure. And we are always talking about the psychological support of a community member and how you handle them. But I don't specialize in that part. I specialize in taking care of you, the first responder. We want to talk about your holistic care and wellness. We want to promote mental and behavioral health for first responders. We want to respond appropriately and effectively to first responders' needs. So why do we want to do this? My third point for this slide, we want to prevent the problems, and we have to make a huge change in order for that to happen. And we have to make it safe so that it can become a new norm to address first responder psychological support issues. And the things that we're looking to prevent, you could see them maybe faster than I can read them, which is we want to stop destructive behaviors from being the norm of the career experience. Sometimes there's a lot of garbage coming in, and then we have a lot of garbage going out. And so I'm going to talk about the pain exchange theory that I wrote when I was working on my master's degree, and how we can definitely breathe in a lot of the ickies, and we can exhale literally and metaphorically lots of love. And if you're familiar with Buddhist psychology, that breathing exercise is actually, it's called Tonglen. So we'll get into that. But we also want to resolve mental health issues, especially before it turns into physical pain and injuries. We're connected, the mind, body, spirit, all functions together. And a lot of times, especially in the beginning of my experiences with first responders, the guys weren't willing to come to therapy um, unless they had chronic headaches, terrible stomach aches, IBS issues, and they were taking, Prilosec for their GERD and Excedrin and drinking coffee all day. They definitely had a pain body, and they weren't connecting it to all the emotional backup that they were experiencing that needed correction and nurturing through the therapeutic process, which might, again, sound a little woo-woo to people, but let me tell you, I don't have a full-time job doing this for 18 years because I'm selling therapy. I'm definitely more of a word of mouth, a type of referral, and I'm honored and I take that very seriously. It's such a privilege. But we want to help you address your mental health issues before they become physical health issues, because as you know, many of the guys take that pain body through their career, and then they're getting type 2 diabetes, they're having heart attacks and strokes, they're dying shortly after retirement, and your suicides are higher than the general population. And men commit suicide 4 times more than women, and first responders commit suicide more than that. So we definitely have to pay attention to that. So I jumped to the fourth idea here, that we want to reduce any ideation, attempts, and completions of first responder suicides. Now, the thing that I have there on the third level that I want to back up to is reducing the elements of personal risk and actual on-the-job errors. When we get complacent, or when we have so much on our mind, or we're in a hurried sort of felt sense, we make errors on the job. And those are probably one of the most challenging sessions, when someone feels guilty or shame for not being competent or thinking that they're not good enough for this job. And so all of this to me is stuff that we want to address, pay attention to, and is a part of first responder psychological support. So let's go ahead to the next slide. If I could figure out how to do that, I keep struggling. Hopefully that'll end as I get the hang of this. But I do have an article that you're more than welcome to email me for. I'm going to present on it more thoroughly in another podcast. I'm putting the mention in here because make it a norm, make it change, make it safe is it's a process, and it does have to come from the top down. And so I provide an article about first responder psychological support with 13 different suggestions that first responder departments can use in order to shift the culture and make this a norm. But right now, I'm going to jump into the suicide psych education, because this is, the heaviest consequence, other than injuries and mental health concerns and relationships deteriorating because of the first responder career. So let's do some suicide psych education for first responders. Again, I had just said men commit suicide 4 times more than women in the United States, and first responders are more than the general population. I want to say that police officers commit suicide more than firefighters, but you can fact check me on that and put some comments in. I have learned to do a clinical assessment of suicide a little differently. I try to do it within the first or second day, depending on how the initial assessment is unfolding. But I break it down in different categories because I have always noticed that first responders tend to shy away from reporting that they have any type of suicide ideation because they don't want someone to Baker Act them. They call that in Florida. We don't have that in Illinois. Um, but they don't want to get petitioned in or told that they must be hospitalized. And that does create a whole bunch of issue. And whether it's voluntary or involuntary and all these other things matters. So I will, again, address a little bit more of that in another podcast. But what I want to do right now is focus on these 4 levels. So I try to explain that most high functioning adults that I have met in and out of therapy have had suicidal fantasies. And this is that jerk the wheel thought, or it's, I could kill myself, but I guess I'll just cut the grass, pay my bills, and do what I'm supposed to. So it's kind of a fleeting thought, but it is a sign that you're overwhelmed. And I put it on the spectrum of noticing suicide ideation, because even though you don't mean it, and maybe even you're making a joke about it, it's still a sign that, hey, you're at level 1 suicide ideation in Sarah's clinical theory here. And we want to pay attention to that. Like, what can we do so that you're not thinking about, your death by your own hand? Now, the second level is passive suicide ideation. I put this one in green because it seems that this is when I get the most self-reporting. This is when people think about dying more often, that it might just be easier to not be here. They're not suicidal. They don't have a plan. They'll emphasize that to me, but they'll say, I do think about suicide or death, and I guess that's not funny. And the answer is, yeah, it's not. That's not good. So I give that a level 2 because it's more than just the fleeting fantasy because you're overwhelmed. This is a little bit more chronic, and people are having a bad couple of weeks, months, or even a couple of years like this. Now, in red, I have suicide ideation. This one, in my experience, is way more severe. And I usually hear about it afterwards because they were scared of themselves at that point. They did have a plan. They were seriously considering it. It was like one more straw and the camel's back is broken. And they might really emphasize to me, I was suicidal last year. I'm not suicidal now. And what makes me so sad about that is through the darkest, most difficult thinking errors, cognitive distortions, really intense emotions, behavior urges to end your life, you are alone and isolated because you are a police officer or a firefighter, or you see yourself as someone, who's the help, not the helpee. So I put that in red because please ask for help. I can still help you. We can still help at the suicide fantasy level. We can help at the passive suicide ideation level, and we can provide interventions and get your mind and your body back on track, even in that red suicide ideation. And I disclose everything about what I think clinically we should do and how we're going to do it, and help you to make decisions so that everything is consensual, depending on what kind of help that you need. Now, if it comes in a crisis form, I've definitely had that in the past where a spouse has contacted me over the red suicide ideation gestures, or a peer supporter has contacted me, or a fire chief, police chief has sort of asked, what do we do in these situations? So again, that's absolutely okay and acceptable, and we could still guide through and help you through all of that. That's a little bit more crisis intervention, and sometimes it's different, as my point was going to be. And then I sort of almost sidetracked in my mind there for a moment. But again, I am happy to explain all the clinical interventions, help you to make decisions so that you feel like you have a choice and that you are participating through consent. But now let's get to suicidal. These are the guys who have already passed, okay? Um, we can't stop those suicides. They have made up their mind. And just like murder is cold-blooded or hot-blooded, so is self-murder, which is what suicide is. And hot-blooded suicides or murders are those that are very impulsive. So that one straw really fell, broke the camel's back, and that person is reacting. And they're reacting in real time at a very fast pace. They didn't even know that they were going to kill themselves today or this week or whatever was going on, but they got those feelings, those thoughts, those behaviors, and completed their suicide. And we do shift the language, by the way. We don't say committed suicide the way that we used to say committed crime. It's a suicide completion. And hot-blooded, again, is impulsive and emotionally reactive. And that's why they died. We couldn't get to them in time because it happened so quickly. Now, cold-blooded murders and cold-blooded suicides, those are planned out. Those are well thought out. And those are the guys that might say, you know, I'm not going to kill myself through the holidays. I don't want my kids to always have an anniversary like that. So I'll wait until the new year. Or I know what method I'm going to use and I know how I'm going to get this completed so that I don't have to be here. And in that way, they end up looking pretty good to us on the outside. This is the guy that's laughing and smiling, and we know maybe that he's going through some things, but there's no hints that, you know, he's going to kill himself. Maybe other in hindsight, we can say, yeah, you know, he started getting rid of some of his things, or some stuff was a little off, or we were a little worried about his stress level. But when you're cold-blooded and you don't want anyone to intervene with your plan, then you work pretty hard to stay under the radar. And that's why cold-blooded suicides happen. So some other people may not agree with these 4 different levels or those 2 types of suicide, or maybe they can expand more. But this is my quick review and lesson so that you can sort of self-evaluate and identify your own risk and understand that yes, first responders, you are not alone. Life and the job is stressful and it causes strain. In fact, life on this globe is dangerous, it's chaotic, and it is unfair. And we have to learn how to cope with it, or we can be pretty vulnerable to this list of types of suicide ideation. So over time, I had learned through listening to Jeff Dill's courses and taking my own classes in college and the beautiful articles that come through about suicide. Dr. Joyner, who's here in Florida, who I do not know personally, is a suicidologist and specializes in all of this. And there were 4 risk factors that I remember learning about, so I'm going to share those. And they are so specific to first responders and they are specific to the general population. But isolation, right? Existential isolation, actual isolation, or that alone and loneliness is such a risk factor. And in the first responder world, we have this culture of don't talk about it, don't cry about it, and don't ask for help, or you're not fit to do the job, or maybe you shouldn't be here, or maybe you need to go do something else. And people don't realize like what a threat that is to a human being to say, you know, you don't belong if you're responding in this way. We want, again, to make it a norm that you are a human and you are going to respond to human illness, death, suffering, stupidity, property destruction, politics, and bullshit in a way that's kind of garbage in overload. But anyway, going back to that isolation, sometimes in the first responder world, I listen for things like I go out in the garage and do my own thing, or I go to that hole in the wall bar by myself and do my own thing, or I just don't go to those parties or those gatherings or any of those events. I don't like to be around people. They start to withdraw socially. And first responders can be pretty isolated to begin with, or very cliquey. And so that isolation factor is a big, big deal when we talk about high risk factors for suicide. Then we have to take a look at the burden factor. I'm the helper, not the helpee. I don't call 911, I am 911. And I don't want to bother you with what I'm thinking. I already think that I don't deserve help, that I may not be worthy of help, that I'm not good enough. And I don't want to burden or bother you with what I'm carrying on my shoulders. Well, let me tell you, first responders, there are groups of people and services. We don't think it's a burden at all. Happy to help. I myself, if I could speak for myself and only myself, I suppose, um, you're never a burden, and I know how to help. And if I don't know how to help in a certain situation, I will help you find someone who can, because I love using that network of people and finding out. But at this point, 18 years in the making, I've got some answers and I'm happy to assist. So no one is a burden. What about that thrill seeker part? So, police will run toward gunfire. I run away. Firefighters run toward fire. I'm not going in there. You guys do a lot of thrill seeking things in your career alone. And I've been in those trainings in the burn towers or going through the SCBA maze. I know there's extreme sports, whether it's hockey or jumping out of an airplane. Everything is super intense. So this is a thrill seeking population, and that puts you at higher risk. Why? Because you might say to yourself, just do it. Don't be a pussy. Pull the trigger. Sorry for the language, but this is how I talk. I gave a fair warning. I might say more words, but to stay on track and to the point, the thrill-seeking edge is dangerous because you can talk yourself into doing life-threatening things easier and better, more skillfully than the average bear. So let's take a look at the ability and means. So I had already mentioned death by gunshot. You guys have weapons, you have ammunition, you know how to use it. You know about putting a baggie over your head, hook it up with a hose to the car. I've heard that joke, first responder humor, a few times. You turn that car on and sit in the garage. And I've definitely heard of many other more gruesome ways to die. And also, like, how to tie the knots. So you choose your method based on what you're comfortable with or what you know about medications even. And so that ability and that means, as dangerous as it feels to talk about it, is a reality. And we're going to face all kinds of these realities in these podcasts and videos, because that's what makes also first responder suicides trickier to treat. As this is a population with all the high risk factors with the ability to complete their suicide. And we want to provide as much information to them as possible so that it doesn't keep staying this way. And all this information is going to unfold throughout this YouTube channel. So why do I have relationships and love down here and the self-monitor statement on this particular slide? So there was a study by Harvard University, and it was about what makes men happy. And it's a longitudinal study, and it has several different successors, re-evaluating what the results are as they continue to do the survey and study. But anyway, the question was, what makes a man happy? They've, since expanded that to women as well. Thank goodness. And it is not your job title. It is not how much money you make. It is not the car you drive or how much sex you're having. It's none of that. The study reveals that around the globe and across cultures, for men or for women, the thing that makes us feel happiest is when we love someone who loves us back. And oh my gosh, do we have some relationship maydays in the first responder world. And so this is also why I talk about spouses needing to be a part of that probationary year where they get this information, where they learn about how do we stay connected and protect each other as we get exposed to all of this shit that happens in the world, because you're there to protect, save, help, rescue, and do all these different interventions on people's worst days. And if you don't know how to process that and cope with that, that toxicity can seep into your personal relationships. So when I talk about how do you prevent suicide, it's contradictory to some of what you're teaching. Like you'll say peer support and reach out and talk to each other and get petitioned in and go to counseling, and all those things are a part of it. They're certainly a part of it. But the main thing is, can you self-care and self-love? Because when you are in that space, you can honor and connect in your relationship. And that's the ultimate safety, is to love someone who's going to love you back. And boy, I can't emphasize that enough. So this is all about self-monitoring. And in the 13 ways that I describe how to make a change, how to make it norm, or a norm to be safe to talk about psychological support issues in the first responder world, we have to learn how to look at ourselves. I've heard and I have seen administration and peer support teams saying, you gotta take on one more thing. You have to make sure someone else is okay. And that's just not realistic. And I don't want to make someone else responsible for another human being like that. We have enough going on in our own lives. So the other idea of how do we prevent these suicides, it comes from within. It's not going to be you controlling someone else from the outside. And that's just the reality of what we're facing. Okay. So at this point, what I will do is take a break. And we have started the Introduction to First Responder Psychological Support course. Again, if you have any questions, you can message me privately in my email at sarahgura@gmail.com. And you are also more than welcome to shoot me a text. It's 815-557-1267. And if I get any spammy stuff, I just block it on the first try. It's not a 24/7 emergency service. Like, I respond on a business day usually. So if there's anything going on that requires an emergency response, I have to refer you to 911, your local emergency room, and get safe in that care, and then tell me how you're doing. Because I'm, again, not an emergency service, but I will answer questions the best that I can. So with all that said, again, my name is Sarah Gura, and I'm a master's level licensed clinical professional counselor in Illinois and a licensed mental health counselor here in Florida. I encourage you to take another deep breath in. And on the exhale, just relax your body one more time as you transition out of this information and either go to the next, video, or go to the next thing that you have planned in life. And I always like to also say, do life so it doesn't do you, and take good care. All right. Bye-bye.